Good morning or good afternoon. I wanted to share a video with you. My friend Joe and I talk regularly on the phone, and he's a very learned man. We first met several years ago when I was living in a Benedictine monastery, and he was a regular visitor at the guest house. Joe was in the process of becoming an Episcopal priest at that time. So, he's got an interesting past and he's got a lot of knowledge. And what I found particularly interesting in this talk was the way that he was able to share the Franciscan Charism as it's expressed in the variety of different orders founded around the name and the ideal of Francis and Clare. I was also very enlightened by his sharing of how this wasn't a complete break with Benedictine spirituality, which was the only form of religious life until Francis, but that it was sort of an expansion or deeper dive into the vision that Benedict expressed in his rule. Anyway, I hope you enjoy this video and I hope that it blesses you. Bye.
So I'm Joe Diele, and I'm a priest over in the Episcopal Diocese of Long Island, one of the co-founders of the Franciscan community here, the Franciscan Community of Compassion. So my connection to Franciscanism, I think, is an important part of how I'll share this, looking at the charism of Franciscanism. And it really all begins uh, when I was 7 years old, meeting my first Franciscan, Sister Christine Marie, and I was a public school kid, so we went over on Wednesday afternoons for what they called religious instruction, and all the kids on the block went to the Catholic school, so they told me all these horrible things about nuns, and so I was terrified walking over from the public school to the Catholic school, and it was only a block away. But you were let out for this release time thing on a Wednesday afternoon, around 1:30 or so, and you attended class, and there she was in the old-fashioned habit, and the only thing I could equate it to was the Capitol. That's what she reminded me of, the Capitol. It was a big dome. She wore a dome on her head, and I thought this was like an odd hat, but there she was. And lo and behold, for a little kid, I was just 7. I thought she was the funniest lady I had ever met in my life. All 7 years of it. She was just hysterical. She had all these jokes. She was a little bit sarcastic, and I picked up a lot of what she was saying. And I knew that I'd be laughing at things that she said that people around me didn't. But I thought she was hysterical. And for me, it was a real entrance into whatever Franciscanism was going to grow into in my life. That there's a great deal of joy, happiness, and funny in this community. Um, I didn't. I went every year to do religious instructions and had different nuns each year, and they were all rather similar. Nobody was as funny as she was, but they were friendly. They um, they greeted you open-heartedly. A friend of mine always talks about. He says, we wound up having the nuns who were always inviting you in for cookies, and they were out in the yard playing ball with you, and they were just with you all the time. So that was my experience of Franciscanism as a kid. I wound up going to Catholic school in 7th and 8th grade, and again, it was really the sisters that I met there that continued this ongoing thing. They were all the same community. And so recently I preached at the funeral of one of my 8th grade teachers. There were 3 of them, and I said, one of the things that I realized at this point in my life, I am the person that I am because of those women. um, they showed me something of Francis. And Annette, whose funeral I preached at, in her dying process, it was rather similar to looking at Francis in his own dying. It was kind of a festival. People were all around. There were always people coming in and going out and bringing food and talking and sitting with her and visiting. And when you read some of those things of Francis in his dying, it was a rather similar thing. And of course, there surely were brothers that tried to clean it all up and make it sound a little bit more solemn in Francis's dying, including his friend who he asked to bring her recipe for cookies and to bring a habit for him, or at least the materials so that he could be buried in the habit, and to bring candles for the funeral. She was a laywoman, Jacoba, Jacoba, a real interesting lady, and she probably in many ways was the first Franciscan woman, um, and surely will have lived that out way after Francis's death. So, but that's kind of my introduction to Franciscanism. Um, I wind up being a postulant for the Franciscan Capuchins in the St. Mary's province in New York here when I was 18. And I was drawn to them because of the particular charism. And the charism was this idea of living a contemplative life in the midst of the world, which was a little different than the OFM, the observant community, or the conventual communities. Um, and of course, at this point in history, they all look the same. They all do the same things. They all, I mean, they're just involved in the same things. But historically, they start in different places. And the observant community, the original community, one could say, of Saint Bonaventure and Anthony of Padua and Duns Scotus and William of Ockham, those friars were all part of that observant community. But then you get the conventuals, and they wanted to live together. The early group were wanderers by and large, and they were very involved in the cities, preaching everywhere. But you almost couldn't, yeah, you almost couldn't figure out where they were all the time. They were on the move. And conventuals lived together, and very much in Catholic religious life, there are things called canon regulars, and they kind of live a community life, but they all go out to work in different places and then return home. And the conventuals wound up really doing that. And of course, some famous ones would be like there's a Joseph Cupertino. There was who was known for levitating. Then there was, of course, Maximilian Kolbe, who dies in concentration camp. Um, there was in New York City. There was Bruce Ritter, who started Covenant House. So those are kind of popular names. And then there were the Capuchins, and the Caps started much later than these other groups. They started in the 1500s, and they really want to return to the idea of living a hermit, or at least a more quiet life. Um, Involved in ministry, but wanting to balance that more. And of course, the more popular ones today would be, Padre Pio and Solanus Casey. Um, so that's kind of like a broad overview, but they today you really would say that they're all involved in this. And what I was thinking of, what it all goes back to, is the personality of Francis, because no matter what congregation, no matter what way of living it, you could always find something of that in Francis himself. He surely enjoyed the hermitage, but he surely enjoyed being with people. He also enjoyed nature, and he enjoyed preaching, and he enjoyed teaching. And Francis kind of then is this person who is filled with life. So maybe the real charism of the Franciscan communities are women and men filled with life and want to live into life. And that, when you talk to different Franciscans of different communities, of different persuasions, no matter what kind of group they are, first order, second order, third order, that's one of the things that seems to be very true about them. There's a wanting to live life to its fullest. There surely is a big sense of joy and happiness and a lot of fun. Um, Even in the most conservative groups of Franciscans that I've come across, there was a great deal of fun. Um, they knew how to laugh. And I think that that is all part of who Francis was as well. Again, we don't get that from too many of his biographers. Francis saw the world as his cloister. And I think everything comes from that. If the world is the place you're going to encounter God, then it's everything in the world that will bring you to God. There's nothing that won't bring you to God, whether it is the creatures or the sun, the moon, the stars, as we encounter in the canticle of Brother Sun. It's everything. The cloistered person encounters God in that space. But Francis said the cloister for him was the world. So he's a walking contemplative. They talk about him running as the running blessings that he offers the world. Yeah, his encounter with the world was the place to meet God. And a definition that I personally like to use for the contemplative is the contemplative is the woman or man who lives with the awareness of God. And it's a broad definition, but I think it's important because sometimes we in our minds, or at least me in my mind, can say that the contemplative is the person who prays in this particular way, or who walks this way, or who encounters the world in this way. Well, what if the contemplative is the one who encounters the world with an openness to realizing God is there? That changes everything. And that's why you'll see among Franciscans every single form of prayer. There's no one way to pray if you're a Franciscan. There are Franciscans who embrace Christian Zen. There are Franciscans who embrace the charismatic renewals in the different churches. There are Franciscans who embrace a very liturgical, even a strict kind of liturgical form of prayer. There are Franciscans who embrace the Carmelite style of prayer, the quiet prayer that Teresa of Avila talks about, or John of the Cross. There are Franciscans who embrace the Ignatian style of prayer, of using one's imagination and dancing around with the scripture and finding in the scripture, yourself. Um, and the reason why that is so is because Francis never said, "This is what it means to be a contemplative. This is what it means to be a Franciscan prayer." No, every single way that a human being prays is a Franciscan way of praying, because the idea is to encounter God no matter where you are, no matter who it is you encounter. That's where you're going to meet Christ. And I'm touched by that line even because the only kind of religious life that would have been around in Francis's time really was Benedictinism. But a key part of Benedictinism is to to see everyone who comes to the guest house as Christ. Well, what if the guest house is the world? Then everyone is Christ. Everyone you meet, everywhere you go. Also, from the rule of Benedict, it would have said even the tools in the barn, or the tools in the kitchen, the pots, pans, they were as important as liturgical vessels. The apron would be as important as the vestments. So, but what if you bring that all into the middle of the world? Then all of a sudden you see everything you do, every work you would have. And you will notice then that Franciscans do every work. There's no work that they don't do. Because why? You're meeting Christ everywhere. And wherever someone needs help, wherever someone needs support, wherever someone needs to be with another person, that's where a Franciscan shows up. So, of course, they would then be in the university, but they would also be in the farm. They would also be in the cities. They would also be doctors and nurses and technicians and lawyers. And pretty amazing where Franciscans show up. And of course, we even live in a time where there's a thing like Franciscan Action Network, where there's political work done among Franciscans in order to help us to think bigger about global issues. So Franciscans are inserted everywhere because that's where life happens, and that's where we meet God. Another important thing would be, again, just making a little bit of a comparison with Benedictinism. There's that sense in Benedictinism of stability. You stay in the monastery, you stay on the property of the monastery. Well, if the world is your monastery, if the cloister is the world, it was very easy then for the friars to move about. And of course, it was from them that the idea of having a breviary in one's hand was necessary, that we weren't going to sing the psalms in chapel. We had to be wherever we were, and we'd have the psalms that we need to pray. So it was a transformation even in church understanding of how to pray even as a community, and to pray wherever you are. A really important thing. Very influenced, Franciscanism is very influenced by, especially um, the community known as the Trappists, the Cistercians, and so the idea of love, which is at the heart of Cistercian spirituality, is truly at the heart of Franciscan spirituality. It's how you live with love for your brother or sister. And of course, if you go through the early rule of Francis, you'll see that, you know, how to treat the brother who really is getting on your nerves, and how to treat that person with love and kindness and respect, and not hold it against them. And so those kinds of details about loving the other are really, really important. Um, Living with this awareness of God means you're also aware that you come up short. And so we hear a lot about this, that Francis was, the founder of the community of penance. And it's very true. It's this idea in the Cistercian world, it would be the vow of conversion that those monks would take. Well, the Franciscan was always in the process of changing his or her mind to God. A call to conversion, a call to penance, a call to be rooted in God and not in things that are passing away, especially doing harm to each other. Humility, obviously called, little brothers, the friars minor. This sense that we're part of the earth, we belong to the earth, we return to the earth, and so we need not lord it over each other. The importance of work, and no matter what the work was. And we know that the early friars, would hire themselves out and work for a few hours, get enough money for food, and move on. Yeah, working with one's hands, really important. Being connected to earth, really important. And so, of course, then you had the other group of friars, those who were the teachers. You had the Anthony of Padua, You had the um, Duns Scotus, and those people who were professors, and they were doing their work, their study was part of their work. So Franciscanism is that big. It's got all of those components. And then, of course, in the time of Francis, women couldn't be out and about, so they wind up being cloistered. But a really important part of even understanding cloistered women um, in the 1200s and before was they were cloistered not so much because the world was so bad. They were cloistered to protect them from the bad world. Um, so very often invading armies and all kinds of crazy folks would try to get at these young women. It was just it was a way to protect them. And so these walls wind up being high, and even in our time, there's a couple of monasteries here in Brooklyn that even have like glass at the top of these walls. But there was this whole idea that they were, yeah, they were cloistered in order to protect them from people who were going to take advantage of them one way or another. But really interesting about Franciscan cloisters, the Poor Clares had a real sense of what was going on in their community, and there was a lot of exchange, a lot of connect. Surely there was offering to the poor. There was food for the hungry. So those kinds of things continued to happen. They understood and experienced what was going on in their world, that it was not a cloister to block them away from the world. It was simply a cloister to protect them from evil folks. Um, and then, of course, we have the third order, and the third order is really an interesting thing. It's broken into two groups. Uh, when you look at this historically, the what we call the third order, uh, it doesn't necessarily mean that it came third in its formation, because in reality, it probably came first. That Francis hung out with people, and they tried to do what he was doing, and eventually some of that got caught up in church authority and church rules and church regulations, and they become the friars and they become the second order. But some other folks, went back to their families and went back to their farm, and they went back to doing what they do, and but they got some teaching from Francis, and then tried to live it. What we sometimes forget is because Francis was so big on Franciscanism being um, without violence, right? And I'm sure it came out of his own experience of war and his own experience of being a prisoner of war. So he asks everyone who is a secular Franciscan to not bear arms. And so, of course, that changes feudal society, because you could not get then the duke or whoever could not get anybody to fight a little war. So once Franciscanism is a spirituality that's shared among lay people, it changes how people have acted towards one another and with one another in feudal society. And then, of course, we hear of Saint Damianos and Francis rebuilding that church, and the priest of the church not accepting money from Francis, knowing that he had taken it from his father. Well, that priest, Sylvester, was one of the first priests to join Francis. And that was the beginning of what would wind up being third order regular. And so it's another form of Franciscanism. So he has a whole bunch of ways of living religious life way before our time and our culture has caught up with him. Uh, Third order folks are real interesting, whether they are regular or secular. um, in that you will find among them people who serve, people who spend a great deal of time in silent prayer, and people who even become hermits. Um, all part of this entire tradition. The other thing that might be interesting to look at because of this whole charism of Francis and living into life and enjoying life and being present to life, we see the Renaissance bloom. We also see in literature and drama friars, whether it's Friar Tuck or it's Friar Lawrence in Romeo and Juliet. Um, it's the friar in Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. It's 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 the friar in there are really a couple of friars in Echo's novel. I think it was The Name of the Rose. So I was just trying to think of a couple of these things today. Um, that each one of those friars is pastoral, caring, but also on the margins. They are not the mainline clergy, even when they are a priest. Um, and that's borne out in literature through the ages. So it would be interesting if I had plenty of time. I would do this. And I would love to go through literature and see where friars are because they're portraying something of what the experience of people has been of the Franciscan charism. That here these people are. They're rather ordinary. They connect us to God, but they also are very much like us, whoever the us is, wherever people meet them. And I think that that's the charism that we try to live, you and I, in our own ways, in our own worlds, as we do the work that's set before us. So I hope that was kind of like a just a broad stroked vision of a possible way of looking at the Franciscan charism, but also maybe to begin a little conversation. Any thoughts?
Well, I very much appreciate the fact that you brought in the comparisons to the Benedictine experience, that being my background, um, and how it just sort of broadened the vision. Um, yeah, that really makes sense to me, and I can really identify with that. Will, do you have anything you want to throw in? You're muted, Will.
That was what I threw in. I had a very short background with the Benedictines. I was in another community, a Benedictine community with Peter.
Oh wow.
But,
Okay.
one thing everything I ever hear about the Franciscan from the day Francis knelt in the Church of San Damiano until now, it was always like just an amen coming from inside of me. Because, it's like that sense of, I've heard this from Franciscans over and over, this is where I belong.
Yeah.
And that is my heart and soul. So
Yeah.
I really appreciated everything you had to say.
So thank you. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that's it. It's our personality. Our personality responds to something in that charism, and the charism is not something I have to put on. Like, oh, it'll fit if I just do this. Or no, it's who you are already, and that's it. It's seeing it. Yeah.
Somebody said that you don't become a Franciscan, you already were one. You just discovered where it
I
was.
agree. I
Yeah.
agree. Yeah. I think it would be fun too, and I haven't done this in any kind of strict way, but to go through even Benedictinism or go through the rule of Benedict, say, and then see how it was born in Francis in a very different way. I mean, he brings Benedictinism out into the world in a very different way, and yet the basics are very much there of what was Benedictinism. So I once gave a talk to a Franciscan community, and the talk was that every Franciscan was a Benedictine. and they had no clue what I was going to talk about then. But just trying to make those connections, because if you just push the Benedictine rule in one way, you realize that, well, okay, either it could stay there in kind of an incubator, which is wonderful and it's fine, and that's Benedictinism. But if you bring it into the world, then it's Franciscanism. So
Peter and I have
You know, one
discussed
of the
that a lot. Yeah.
yeah, one of the things that jumps out at me all the time that people miss about the rule of Benedict was that he sets out all of these very concrete things that you need to do, but he always follows it up with, and if this doesn't work, try something else. And it became so fossilized over the years that and try something else was never an option.
yeah, and it's kind of what we all do. I mean, surely Franciscans do it too. It's just part of human nature, and that's why another Franciscan group starts.
Mm.
Anytime Franciscanism gets stuck in concrete, then another group says, wait a second, that's not the charism. And they go another way.
When you said that your early contact with Franciscanism was the sisters, I was raised in an evangelical world, but my very first contact with the Franciscans was the Sisters of the Atonement from Graymore.
Oh, okay, Graymore, yeah.
And it was not really even so much what they said as who they were,
Yeah.
their presence. That had such an impact, even to this day, such an impact on my life. There's people you meet in your life, you just kind of pass along, but their lives just impacted my life.
Wow.
So deeply. Yeah.
Yeah. Interesting. It's kind of just interesting. For whatever reason, today, I have been focused on an atonement sister that I met in my year as a seminarian working in a parish. And I don't know why her name keeps coming up today. And I was going to go look on their website and see maybe she died or something. But yeah.
The sisters I knew, they were actually sisters.
Oh, wow.
At the time, it was Sister Mary Jude and Sister Teresa. Now it's Sister June and Sister Teresa Sclereth was their last name.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah, and they're still both alive.
Oh, that's great. That's so good.
That we should
Could you tell us a little?
I'm sorry.
Go ahead, Will. Please.
That we should have that. That is the dream of my heart, to just our presence, not necessarily what we say or do, but just our presence, that it would so touch people's lives.
Yeah.
That they would want to embrace the Franciscan way.
Yeah.
Joe, could you say a little bit about the community that you're involved with?
So we started a community. It was really it's very, very, it's kind of comical how this started, because I wasn't sure. I have for years wanted to be connected to a Franciscan community. As I said, when I was 18, I was a Capuchin postulant, and of course I was filled with all the ideals of being a Franciscan and all of that. And I didn't see too many people who lived up to my ideal, so therefore I left. But anyway, and then I realized that whatever Franciscanism was at that point in my life, it was reflected all the time in who I was and what I was doing, and I would come out of whatever it was, doing a funeral, a wake, just, and people would say, "Oh, what kind of Franciscan are you?" I'd say, "I'm not. I'm I'm just a diocesan priest. I'm just, yeah." And that would happen for years and years and years. And so it made me continue to think, and of course I've been connected to those Franciscan sisters since I was 7. So that always continued, and I did a lot of work with them, and we ran lots of retreats together. So that kind of has always been there. And then I continued connecting with the Capuchins over the years. They have been some of the great confessors that I've gone to, and just some great guys that I've shared with over the years. Then when I left the Roman Church and joined Independent Church, I was part of the Catholic Apostolic Church in North America, and I was a Franciscan in their church, and it was the community of reconciliation that I was part of, and it was good. It was a good connection, and they were great people. And then, of course, moving into the Episcopal Church, I I was interested in first in that group that has members in even in England. I guess they were OSFs, right? OSFs, and so I was interested in them, and then in talking to some of the folks, um, they said, "Oh, look into, the community of Francis and Clare," and so then I started talking to people in your community. Uh, and then my bishop said, "Well, why don't you start something right here?" And so I said, "Okay, yeah, we could do that." And so that's kind of how we began. And it was very funny. I was yeah, I was thinking about this. I talked to the bishop again, and he said, "Yeah, just start it." And so the idea of compassion is kind of dear to my own heart. In that what for me, whatever it means to be a Christian means to somehow be with people and to in fact suffer with people, not necessarily in a some sort of masochistic way, but really to somehow feel in your heart the struggle or the pain of the world around you. And um and so this idea of being with people on the margins is kind of the charism. And so there's eight of us. My wife is a member of the community, and she works with the Actors Fund, and she works in a residence where actors, and especially now it's been a really tough couple of years for them, have been out of work, and they basically run a single room occupancy for people who have been part of the acting profession. Some of them are actors, some of them were the people who sold the tickets at theaters. And unique to her building, she's also works with people who are homeless, ordinary homeless. They're not actors. They are many times ex-offenders or ex-drug addicts or continuing drug addicts. So she definitely works on the margins. And each person then kind of in our community has connections like that. Um, Matthew is a professor at Brooklyn College, and again, it's a very Brooklyn place, and so he connects with really ordinary kids who are struggling and who, yeah, some of whom are not even making it. I mean, but he's there with them. As well as Matthew also does a thing for our diocese, connecting us to the whole world of ecology and how do we, yeah, how do we care for our earth? And so again, he's there on the margins. And Isaiah is a priest from our diocese, and he is immersed in in ordinary people's lives and their spiritualities. So he's so immersed in understanding um, each kind of spiritual movement that that at times people might be a little put off by him because he really understands indigenous spirituality from a whole bunch of cultures. He himself is Filipino, and it's really interesting with whom he connects and brings around. It's just yeah. So he's definitely somebody on the edge himself, and invites other folks in. Sybil is a woman who grew up in Africa. She happens right to be right there now in Ghana. She is right now teaching. Got some sort of grant from Germany and is teaching. But her whole experience is what does it mean to be a queer person, a queer woman uh, from Africa? And so her writings, and she just sent me another interesting writing, uh, are encompasses all of these questions, thoughts, and experiences, and her whole way of looking at God is spectacularly different. And so whenever we do sharing in our prayer together, it's just wonderful because she has another whole world. So she's definitely on the margins. So it our charism is that, and it's to kind of embrace that sense of the world. Um, so I hope that gives a little bit of a picture of a Franciscan community of compassion.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm going to, Will, do you have any more questions?
I don't. I'm just going to throw something in that I don't know, Joseph, if you've watched, but Peter and I have both watched this series called The Chosen.
Peter was just talking about it.
I've got to tell you something. That thing is so Franciscan.
Wow.
I'm watching it again. Jesus is so Franciscan in this thing. And you talk about people, and his whole community was formed about people on the margins. They were all people. They were all people that didn't fit in with anybody else,
Uh-huh.
and people that didn't think they would fit in. How could you possibly love me if you knew everything I've done? You wouldn't possibly love me, and yet
Right.
they were the ones that he chose.
Yeah.
You think that, Peter? That Franciscan? Do you see that Franciscan thing?
Well, actually, when you were saying that, I was like, yeah, but actually, Francis was like Jesus.
Oh yeah.
Do you know that there are more books written about Francis than there are about Jesus?
Oh wow.
Yeah, it's an interesting one of those interesting facts. But from the the whatever it is, the Congress of whatever it is, but they have more books about Francis listed than Jesus.